The prefrontal cortex is extensively integrated with the limbic system in larger limbocortical networks, most notably with the frontoparietal network, undertaking executive functions such as planning, decision-making, and problem-solving. Broca's area is involved in the production of language which, if awry from a tumour or stroke, results in motor aphasia/dysphagia. The temporal lobe is important for auditory processing, primary auditory cortex, memory formation with the hippocampus, and language comprehension from Wernicke's area. The basal ganglia has a cortioganglionic loop with indirect and direct pathways containing recurrent feedback, producing synchrony to carry out whole plans of movement and smoothing out movements from direct that causes initiation and inhibition from terminating movement by the indirect. Yeah. Basal ganglia forms a gangliocortico loop with indirect and direct pathways containing recurrent feedback, producing synchrony to carry out whole plans of movement and smoothing out movements.
Hey guys, welcome to our video on the nervous system, where we're going to be detailing specifically its structure and function. The nervous system behaves as the body's control center, with a critical role in governing homeostatic mechanisms, coordinating functions, and enabling higher cognition. The nervous system is a highly complex and integrated network responsible for regulating and coordinating body functions, enabling sensory perception, and facilitating cognitive processes. It can be divided into two main components, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, each with distinct structural adaptations and functions. However, they work in unison to maintain our internal homeostasis, respond to stimuli, and the overall ability to perceive and interact with the world around us. Now let's delve into the structure of the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain is the most complex organ in the body, consisting of billions of neurons and supporting glial cells. It can be further divided into several major regions. Number 1. The cerebrum, which is part of the neocortex. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, divided into two hemispheres, left and right, connected by the corpus callosum, which is a highway network allowing communication between the two sides of the brain. Each hemisphere is further divided into four lobes: frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital, with more specialized functions, which we will explore lower down. The frontal lobe is responsible for motor control, housing the primary motor cortex, which is involved in patterning voluntary movement. It undertakes executive functions, language production from Broca's area, and personality. Part of the frontal lobe is the prefrontal cortex, which is extremely integrated with the limbic system in larger limbocortical networks, more notably the frontoparietal network, or the central executive networks, which undertakes executive functions, planning and decision making, and problem solving. Part of the frontal lobe is the prefrontal cortex, which is extensively integrated with the limbic system in larger limbocortical networks. Part of the frontal lobe is the prefrontal cortex, which is extensively integrated with the limbic system in larger limbocortical networks. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex is most notably found in the default mode network, while the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is part of the central executive network, which undertakes executive functions, planning, decision-making, and problem-solving. The default mode network, however, is utilized in rumination and lower-level tasks. In between these two large-scale networks is the salience network, which overall filters out the stimuli and distributes them for whether they will be responded to by the default mode network or the central executive network. The prefrontal cortex, with such a limbocortical connection, is crucial in influencing behaviors and providing personality, but also undertaking higher cognitive tasks. The frontal lobe also has a part called the Broca's area, which is involved in the production of language, and if awry from maybe a tumor or a stroke, can result in motor aphasia or dysphagia. The parietal lobe is vital for processing sensory information, such as touch, temperature, and pain. This is all undertaken by the primary somatosensory cortex. It is involved in spatial orientation and perception, with more specialized regions such as the inferior parietal lobe and lateral parietal lobe, also part of larger scale networks such as the CEN and DMN, and primarily integrated into the salience network, feeding in sensory salient stimuli and determining which large-scale network is going to undertake the behavioral output. The temporal lobe is primarily important for auditory processing, as it houses the primary auditory cortex. It's important in memory formation, undertaken by the hippocampus, and language comprehension from Wernicke's area. The occipital lobe, finally, is primarily involved in visual processing and houses the primary visual cortex. Now, looking at more rudimentary structures, we are going to have a look at the diencephalon. Part of the diencephalon is the thalamus, which acts as a relay station, transmitting sensory and motor signals to the cerebral cortex. It plays a role in consciousness, sleep, and alertness. The basal ganglia, consisting of the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, caudate nucleus, GPI and GPE, globus pallidus internus and externus, lentiform nucleus, substantia nigra, all are integrated into forming a larger cortico-gangliocortical loop with indirect and direct pathways containing recurrent feedback which produces synchrony and neural network oscillations. These are fundamental to carrying out whole plans of movement and smoothing out movements from the direct pathway which initiates them, and inhibition and termination of the movement by the indirect pathway. The basal ganglia, therefore, is extremely important clinically, especially in neurodegenerative conditions such as Parkinson's disease. The hypothalamus regulates homeostasis by controlling autonomic functions such as body temperature, hunger, thirst, and circadian rhythms. It receives important visceral inputs from receptors and controls the outputs via the endocrine system, performing vital homeostatic mechanisms and controlling secretions of the pituitary gland. Now, looking at the brainstem. The midbrain contains structures like the tectum and tegmentum involved in visual and auditory processing, motor control, and arousal. The pons act as a bridge between different parts of the nervous system, including the cerebrum and cerebellum. It is involved in sleep regulation, respiration, swallowing, and facial expressions. The medulla oblongata controls vital autonomic functions such as the heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration. It also houses reflex centers for coughing, sneezing, and swallowing. Now, looking at the cerebellum. It is located beneath the occipital lobes. The cerebellum has two hemispheres connected by the vermis and a highly folded surface of folia. It coordinates voluntary movements, balance, and posture, and is also important in motor learning. It fine-tunes motor activity by comparing intended movements with actual movements and making necessary adjustments. Now, returning back to the limbic system. It includes structures such as the hippocampus, amygdala, cingulate gyrus, and fornix. This integrated loop is important in regulating emotions, memory formation, and retrieval of these memories. The hippocampus is crucial for forming new memories, while the amygdala are involved in emotional processing, particularly providing fear and pleasure particularly encoding fear and pleasure stimuli. Now, looking at the spinal cord. The spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata to the lumbar region of the vertebral column, after which it turns into spina equina, or horse hairs. Search up what spina equina means. Looking at the spinal cord, which extends from the medulla oblongata to the lumbar region of the vertebral column, after which it turns into the cauda equina, which is Latin for horse's tail. It is protected by the spinal vertebrae, meninges. The spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata to the lumbar region of the vertebral column, after which it becomes the cauda equina, or horse's tail in Latin. It is protected by the spinal vertebrae, meninges of pia, dura, and arachnoid, and coated in cerebral spinal fluid. The spinal cord is divided into the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions containing grey matter, or the neural cell bodies, and white matter, or the myelinated axons. The spinal cord serves as a conduit for transmitting information between the brain and the rest of the body. It also integrates reflexes, which are autonomic responses to stimuli that do not require any cortical input. For example, the knee-jerk reflex. Now, delving a bit deeper, let's look at the structure of neurons, which have three main parts: the cell body, containing the nucleus and organelles; the dendrites, branch-like structures that receive signals from other neurons; axons, long slender projections that transmit electrical impulses and action potentials away from the cell body to other neurons, which are often insulated by myelin sheaths. Neurons are the functional unit of the nervous system, responsible for transmitting information through electrical and chemical signals. They communicate via synapses when neurotransmitters are released to propagate the signal to the next cell. Assisting neurons are glial cells, which support their function. The different types consist of astrocytes, which are star-shaped cells maintaining the blood-brain barrier, providing nutrients to neurons, and regulate extracellular ionic environments. Oligodendrocytes produce myelin in the central nervous system, whereas Schwann cells produce myelin in the peripheral nervous system. If you want to hear more about the Schwann cells, please don't hesitate to check out our video on the quantum liver histology.